Would you characterise yourself as a hopeful person?
Oh, yes, I think I would. I think there's a lot of awful things that have happened around people I know, but I've also seen people sort of fight back, push on, and that has made me a very hopeful person, yes.
This is Indrajit Roy, a professor of global development politics at the University of York in the UK. I know Indrajit well. We worked together on a podcast series called India Tomorrow, around the time of the 2019 Indian elections. In that series, we dug deep into the knotty issues of Indian democracy, from the politics of Hindu nationalism and Kashmir to inequality and the aspirations of young Indians. I remember when we made this podcast a couple of years ago, you told me that you were starting to work on this concept of hope in politics. Tell me how you first got interested in the idea of hope.
So my doctoral work was in rural India, in the northern Indian plains, what's called the Gangetic Plains. And it was on politics of the poor. And it's an area where you have some of the poorest people in the world living. And when I went there to do my fieldwork, I was told stories of how things are so bad there. People are in desperate situations. They're often hopeless. So I hung out with people, stayed with them, and I realized that there was a great deal of talk about the future, hope for things that they would do or things that their lives would improve, hope that they would do things so that their children wouldn't have to lead as desperate a life as they did. And I think my work alerted me to the fact poor people may lack lots of things. Hope is not one of them.
Narendra Modi went on to win a second term as Prime Minister in the 2019 elections, with an increased majority for his Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. Now, he's standing for his third term.
Millions of Indians across 49 constituencies have begun casting ballots as the country's 6-week-long election enters its final stages.
Voting began in the first states on April the 19th, and the results are expected 6 weeks later on the 4th of June. For Indrajit, Modi and his government have overseen a hollowing out of India's democracy. But he says that's only part of the story, and he's just written a book called Audacious Hope, an archive of how democracy is being saved in India, in which he charts the ways various groups of Indians are fighting back. And so I've been speaking to Indrajit for this episode about the politics of hope and where he sees it flourishing in India. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. What does it mean to you to be living in hope?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think lots of times hope gets conflated with lots of other ideas like aspiration, like utopia. So I think it's a really good place to start, Gemma. Thanks. I think hope is, for one thing, it's a collective emotion, if you will, and it's about collectively thinking of how you want to live your life, where aspiration is often very individualistic. Hope is something that people think of together with others. And of course, that's the starting point. But hope is also about not giving up. It's about pursuing a collective objective despite lots of difficulties and pursuing them without quitting.
And how have different philosophers approached the idea of hope as a political or social force?
So I have to say, philosophers haven't always been very enthusiastic about hope. I think it was Albert Camus who said hope equals resignation. For him, hope was surrendering to inertia. It was about fatalism. It was defeatist. I think it was Henry Desroches who called hope a rope. He said it was a sorcerer's trick. It's like you throw a rope up in the air and you expect it to stand. That's hope. And of course, there was Hannah Arendt, who very powerfully wrote against hope. She said hope was the biggest enemy of the Jewish people during their time in Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. So for Hannah Arendt, hope was a hindrance to action, really, because it kept people waiting. But I have to say that way of thinking about hope is a very passive way, in the sense that you hope for something to be done for you. But others have taken a more active reading of hope. So they think about the hope to do things. So you have, for example, Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educationist, who spoke about hope as a call to action, about denouncing all injustice, about protesting against abuse. And you had bell hooks, for whom hope was linked to a basic trust in life. For her, hope was about thinking about life worth living and life worth defending. And you defend what matters to you as a community, as a family, etc. None of these people, suffer from a delusion that hope will somehow magically appear. They all sort of encourage you to think about hope as something that you have to act towards. You have to do something for it. And that, as you can imagine, is the way of thinking of hope that I've found most useful in my work and on which I've drawn.
You've written a new book called Audacious Hope, an archive of how democracy is being saved in India. Before we get into what you've been chronicling, what to you are the major signs that democracy is being eroded in India and that it needs to be saved?
India became a democracy in 1950, but it often was called an imperfect democracy. Despite that, it sustained itself. And, barring a brief period in the 1970s, India has remained largely democratic. And some have argued, and I agree with this assessment, that since the 1990s, democracy has in fact deepened in India. Many more people are able to represent themselves. Many more regions find a voice in what's called the Lok Sabha, the equivalent of the House of Commons. So many of those achievements have been under threat since 2014, when the BJP under Narendra Modi came to power. And what we see is a very steadfast hollowing out of India's democracy. Not in the sense of Modi being a dictator who's going to suspend elections and parliaments and constitutions and take over total power, but in a much more insidious way, where the institutions of democracy are being gradually hollowed out and the idea of a democratic culture is being eroded. The Lok Sabha, the place where consultations over policy should happen, has been systematically disempowered. So, lots of bills, lots of issues that need to be passed into legislation simply don't come through the Lok Sabha for discussion, or if they come, they're very hurriedly dispensed with. Many decisions are quite arbitrarily taken. Back in 2016, India rendered illegal about 85% of all the currency in the country through what was called the demonetization.
Thousands of people have gathered here in central Kolkata to protest against the Prime Minister's demonetization plans.
So high-value currency notes were rendered illegal. That decision was not taken in Parliament. It was taken by the Prime Minister rather arbitrarily. Political adversaries are willfully targeted, and we've seen a lot of that happening in India recently. We've noticed a decline in journalistic and academic freedom. It's not so much that journalists are hounded out, although that also happens, but the media is expected to and has become very complicit and compliant with the government. And of course, most spectacularly, violence against religious minorities, especially Muslims, has seen an upswing. And there have been a lot of talk in the public domain about how India should be steered towards becoming a Hindu Raj or a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu ethnocracy, where the will of the Hindu people really dominate. Now, again, there's no formal declaration of India as a Hindu republic yet. But the public narrative is infused with Hindu idioms, Hindu worldviews. And some would say, well, that's natural in a country where Hindus are 85% of the majority. But it's one thing for Hindus to show their religiosity. It's another thing for it to inform politics. So the democratic ideals of freedom, equality of all people, etc., are a bit under cloud in India.
And your book sets out to chronicle a number of different examples of Indians who are fighting back against what you just described, this, as you see it, a democratic backsliding, I think you called it. And one of them that runs throughout your book is what happened in response to India's Citizenship Amendment Act, which was introduced in 2019. Can you explain what that was and what ostensibly it was designed to do?
Sure. And I think this particular act is a really good example of how there's an attempt to Hinduize the entire political fabric and to introduce religion into politics. So this Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA as it's called for short, was a legislation to fast-track citizenship. And it was framed in very nice, benign terms. And specifically, it would fast-track citizenship for religious minorities in the Muslim-majority countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Now, this was great because, of course, Islamist fundamentalism in these countries is a very real threat. But what this act does in the Indian context is to introduce a religious filter. And it goes on to specifically say that Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, and Parsis, so 6 religious communities, are listed as people who would be eligible for this fast tracking of citizenship. Now, of course, who's excluded from all of this? Yes, atheists are excluded. Yes, Baha'is are excluded. But the largest, biggest community that is excluded are Muslims. And Muslim refugees who often need to flee persecution from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And so it was very clear that Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Christians, Jains, Parsis, etc. were all labeled as citizens, refugees about to be citizens. Who would be illegal infiltrators? Everyone knew. It's an open secret. Anyone who's familiar with the BJP speak, as we call it, would know that it's a reference to Muslims. And that's what got a lot of people agitated. Not only Muslims, of course, who often fear that this law would be directly used to strip them of citizenship, especially in the border areas where it's very difficult to pinpoint who's a citizen and who's not, but also among many Hindus and others who did not want religion to become a part of political citizenship in the country. And many Hindus who had themselves fled or had been expelled from Pakistan or Bangladesh, who knew exactly what the mixing of religion in politics does, were among the first to stand up and say, this is not what we want India to be.
It was a day of unrest in India again over that controversial new citizenship law that critics say discriminates against Muslims in some areas.
So, Indrajit, this law sparked huge protests across India, people doing sit-ins for months, marches, lots of banners, placards, a lot of anger. How did the state react to that?
The state was brutal in its repression. To begin with, they targeted many of the students who were often leading those protests and processions. They would enter campuses of many of the universities where these student protesters were. They would target many of the people who were part of these sit-ins and throw them into prison without any justification except to say that they were disturbing public order. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, the police tried a mix of various tricks. So, of course, they would often brutally attack students, enter campuses. And in some of these sit-ins, because it was so bitterly cold at night, women would be sitting with blankets and the police would swoop down and take away the blankets. Things that ranged from the macabre to the petty.
Why, for you, is this an example of hope? Why did you include it in your archive?
So what was fascinating was when the law was enacted in Parliament, a lot of people assumed that because of the sheer majority that the government enjoyed in Parliament, the law would sail through and everyone in India would fall in line. And what was interesting is that very few people did. People were out there protesting. And if you remember, when I talked about hope right in the beginning, I'm thinking of hope as a way of denouncing abuse, as a way of fighting injustice. This was a very clear example of how numerous Indians, despite all odds, were out on the streets protesting a divisive law. And I found that almost moving, touching, because they didn't have to do it. For a lot of them, they wouldn't be affected by this law at all, perhaps. But it was the principle of a divisive citizenship law which many people were really against. And that, to me, seemed the best example of what hope, especially audacious hope, would be.
Singing and dancing, but also accompanied by protests. The Narendra Modi government is implementing a controversial citizenship law.
The protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the implementation of the law itself were interrupted by the COVID pandemic, and things have stalled since then. But in March, just a few weeks before the elections, the BJP government enacted the citizenship law, and it sparked a new wave of protests.
Hi, I'm Katie Riley. On the Slow Newscast from Tortoise, Donald Trump became the first former U.S. president in history to face a criminal trial.
The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records.
This is not a trial. This is not an act of criminality.
We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct.
This is the story of his first week in court, told through the transcripts. Listen now to the Slow Newscast wherever you get your podcasts.
Another example that you use in your book is the farmers' protests that erupted in India in late 2020. What were the protesters angry about?
The government passed 3 laws that were designed to bring farmers into direct dealing with the market. So the state in India has a very extensive role, and among them is a protective role when it comes to agriculture. These laws would have dismantled that protective role and exposed farmers to national and international markets directly, which also means, exposing them to price fluctuations, contracts with big businesses, which could be detrimental to their interests. So many farmers were upset with these laws. They were also upset at the way in which those laws were introduced. Again, the laws were introduced in the Lok Sabha, the House of Commons, but there was not even a proper discussion of the laws. I think we can all agree that procedures matter in a democracy. And so if you're sort of just pushing laws through without proper consultation, I think that's a problem.
And what did the farmers do in response? Because it was a real movement of anger from across the country. Tell us what actually happened.
What you saw was farmers from across the country, but especially the northern regions, the Punjab, Haryana and Uttar Pradesh regions, because of the proximity to Delhi. They really decided to take matters into their own hands.
Protesting farmers have clashed with the police. The farmers are demanding minimum guaranteed prices for a range of crops.
They converged on Delhi from literally 4 different directions in order to take their protest to the capital, because that's where the seat of power is. And those protests were largely non-violent. They did turn into violence on odd occasions when they were provoked by the police, but they were largely non-violent. Remember that India is, or at least is considered to be, a largely agricultural country. And farmers have an almost mythic sort of position in the Indian imagination. And some of us can say that's orientalizing it, etc. But the fact is, farmers are extremely important to the country's economy, and their suffering really tugs at the hearts of many people.
Scenes of chaos erupt as police prevent farmers from reaching highways leading to the capital, New Delhi.
On Republic Day, on the 26th of January in 2021, they tried to enter Delhi in a procession, because officially you have Republic Day celebrations, which are the formal sort of processions where the army and the state send in their official delegations. So the farmers tried to organize their own parallel public procession, and there was confusion about the routes.
Thousands of farmers occupy India's most prominent landmark, the iconic Red Fort, blocking highways and roads.
There was a kerfuffle with the police, and it seemed a section of the farmers sort of took off and tried to insult the national flag at the Red Fort. And that one incident was really taken up by the government and the supporting media in a way to dismiss their entire movement, and would give the government an excuse to arrest the farmers. And that's when the farmers' leaders of the time, it was a round-faced, stocky, middle-aged man by the name of Mahendra Singh Tikait, who used to be a former policeman. So a very unlikely rebel, but he broke down on national TV, where he dared the government to come and arrest him. And those tears really turned the tables, because even more farmers from across northern India converged onto Delhi. They set up in the night, and there was these very famous scenes, tiny temples across northern India would send delegations of farmers to support a farmer in need. And, with those added reinforcements, the farmers stayed put. The government didn't dare to arrest them. And eventually the farmers won out with their demands. They wore the government down, and the Prime Minister himself announced that those 3 legislations that were so offensive to the farmers would be repealed.
Narendra Modi has announced the scrapping of agricultural reform laws that have been the cause of a year of protests by hundreds of thousands of farmers.
This was a very rare instance of the government actually backing down. And for me, again, this was an excellent example of how hope can work. The hopefuls were able to get what they wanted.
And you've also focused, Indrajit, on artists, musicians, poets, satirists trying in their own way to push back in support of democracy in India. It's a great part of your book because it's a great mixture of people with different causes and mediums and different ways that they're doing this. But one of them is music, and an example you pick out is a song, a Hindi version of the iconic Italian resistance song Bella Ciao, done by a musician called Poojan Sahil. And this went viral around the time of the farmers' protest.
The lyrics sort of went along the lines that as long as I have life left in me, I will sing, and you merciless ones will have to go back to wherever you came from, in that sense.
Because the title is Wapas Jao, isn't it? Which means go back.
Yes, indeed. Then the lyrics go on to say, well, so that the sun can shine again in the sky and the ashes of your plans will go back with you. So in that sense, it was really about determination. And the song is about battling injustice, battling tyranny. In this case, of course, we know at the end the laws were repealed. But even if the laws hadn't been repealed, the idea, the imagination that you can think of a world where people can lead their lives in a fair and just way and not be pushed around by powerful folk was quite incredible. And again, it's a way in which art and hope really come together. In this case, you look at this one poet, who was he? He's not somebody well-connected or powerful or patronized by the state. And yet his rendition spoke to so many millions of people. And I think it's a really fascinating way of thinking about hope and the politics of hope, really.
You write in your book that fixating on democracy's collapse in India is not only counterproductive, but it's also extremely unfair to the increasingly desperate attempts at salvaging democracy by people we've mentioned, students, farmers, artists. I wondered, though, how widespread that fight back is. How widespread is this feeling of political hope in India?
But that's a really good question, because if you looked at the numbers and the election results over the last few years, you would be tempted to feel that there's really nothing that the opposition can look forward to. But I think that would be only looking at a slice of the vast array of politics. Democracy is about elections and institutions, but it's also about what's going on in the public culture, in the public sphere. And if you look at the pushback against the attempts at eroding democracy, you can't help but notice how, in fact, it's quite widespread. Many of these protests were countrywide. And I think in social terms, yes, there are huge areas where people are quite fed up with the BJP. Now, what happens, of course, with elections is that you have to choose an alternative. And sometimes it appears to people that there is no alternative. But I don't think there is no alternative is, of course, the case anymore, because lots of people, especially in these elections, lots of people are talking about, how they might support candidates from the opposition alliance. There have been sparks of hope that the opposition itself has set up, and they've been able to raise issues of redistribution, talk about fairer, equitable share that people might have in resources. And I think those are hopeful moments. Again, I appreciate that those are moments, but that's what hope is about. It's about looking for those little sparks that could generate then into something bigger.
Thank you so much, Indrajit, for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Take care.
That's it for this week's episode. The Conversation has been running a series of articles about the ongoing Indian election, and we'll be covering the result when it's announced on June the 4th. We'll put a link to that coverage in our show notes. If you're interested in hearing more from Indrajit, do go back and listen to our India Tomorrow series that we ran back in 2019. That's on the Conversations podcast called The Anthill. We'll put a link to that in our show notes too. This episode was written by me, Gemma Ware, and produced by Mend Marawani with assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Khan is our global executive editor, and Soraya Nandi does our transcripts. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.